Hey everybody, Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with another lecture in our weekly series. This one is called the Bogo-Indian Defense, and we want to thank our sponsor, Patrick Wheeler, who sponsored many lectures. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, contact Karen at atlchessclub.com, and you too can sponsor a lecture. Now the Bogo-Indian, as Wikipedia indicates, starts in this position, this one here. Where black plays bishop b4 check, which we're going to discuss on an actual board without this Wikipedia article. And it talks about how white can play differently, and you could get a Nimzo-Indian or a Queen's Gambit declined or other openings. The Bogo-Indian is named after F.M. Bogo-Yubov, who was a famous grandmaster, played match with Alekhine for the World Championship. And saying Bogo-Yubov takes a long time, so Bogo, that's easier. Okay, and that's been played in common for over 100 years. We've been seeing Bogo-Indians. Now, white has two main moves, bishop d2, which is the most common. It even says it's the most common. And then knight bd2, which is an alternative. And if white plays knight c3 in this position that you see in the diagram here, that's more of a Nimzo-Indian than a Bogo-Indian. And typically, the reason white plays knight f3 early is to avoid the Nimzo-Indian. So it's unlikely white's going to play knight c3. Okay, so the first game we're going to look at is a game played between Magnus Carlsen and Arkadij Naiditsch at the Grenke Rapid Playoff in 2015. And I wanted to show some games where white won and some games where black won, so you weren't thinking like, well, this opening wins for somebody, because it doesn't. Generally, the better player wins the game, generally. And that goes with a lot of openings, but I think especially the Bogo-Indian, because it's very strategical. So knight c3 is one move, and then black plays bishop b4, and that's a different lecture. That would be a Nimzo-Indian lecture. Okay, and white can also play g3. That would be the Catalan lecture. White's playing the Catalan. Okay, when white plays knight f3, black has four moves that grandmasters play often. There's d5, which could transpose into different openings. If white plays g3, the Catalan. If white plays knight c3 and bishop g5, the Queen's Gambit declined. It could transpose to a Ragozin after knight c3, bishop b4, which looks like a Queen's Gambit and a Nimzo-Indian. And black can also play c5, which is the Benoni, especially if white plays d5, modern Benoni. Black can play b6, which I lectured on 2 or 3 weeks ago. This is the Queen's Indian. And the Bogo-Indian is the lecture today. That's bishop b4 check. Now again, if white plays knight c3, that's more of a Nimzo-Indian, where white's playing knight f3 on move 4, which is called the Kasparov variation. Kasparov revitalized this with the Nimzo-Indian move order in his match with Karpov, in one of his matches with Karpov. Okay, queen d2 is not very good because it loses a queen, and I've never seen knight fd2, but maybe that'll be the new move in the future, knight fd2. Never seen it before, but okay, so the two main moves are bishop d2 and knight to d2, and the difference is after knight to d2, typically, white gets the two bishops, but black has a lot of choice here. Black can play almost any move. After bishop d2, we're threatening the bishop, so that's a little more forcing. And most super GMs who have white in this position actually will play both moves. They'll play bishop d2 sometimes and knight bd2 sometimes because they don't want their opponent to easily prepare for them. And I would say the Bogo-Indian is more popular at the top level than the Benoni, but d5 is the most common move here at the top level right now. And 20, 30, 40 years ago, b6 was the most common move. We saw a lot of Queen's Indians in the 80s and 90s. Okay, so bishop b4 check. This is the game Carlsen-Naiditsch from 2015. Carlsen played knight bd2. That's one of the two main moves. And black played b6. Black can play many ways here. Black can play d5, black can play c5, black can castle, but he decided to play b6 and get his bishop out right away. a3, And when this happens, like 95% of the time, black takes the knight on d2. Otherwise, black's like losing a tempo if he moves his bishop back somewhere, and he's giving white the center with e4. Notice in this position, white can't play e4 because the knight is pinned. So that would just lose a pawn. Okay, so bishop takes d2 check, played by Naiditsch. Queen takes. Often, white plays queen takes instead of bishop takes because white wants to fianchetto his bishop once he plays b3 or b4. But you can also take with the bishop. Castles, e3, bishop b7, very positional play, b4, a5, and they decided to trade everything on the queen side. Now e4, rook takes, and queen e7, threatening the pawn on b4, so c5. White has the two bishops, white has more space, but black has a nice bishop on b7 and a nice knight on e4, and black's castled and white hasn't. So white's hoping black doesn't do anything scary. White develops his bishop, castles, and then has the advantage of the two bishops, plus the nice space advantage on the queen side. Okay, f5, defending the knight again. Bishop e2. Knight c6, developing his last piece. Bishop c3, defending the pawn. Magnus doesn't mind giving up his dark squared bishop because his bishop is blocked by so many pawns. It's not really very active right now. So he just defends the pawn on b4. They trade again. Magnus takes with the d pawn because Magnus wants the d4 square for his knight, and he wants to be able to play b5 later. Probably if I was playing a blitz game, I would take with the b pawn without thinking. But d takes may be a little bit better and give more winning chances. And you can see in a position like this, these are the kind of positions where the better player wins. Nobody's winning right now. It's double-edged. Material's a little different. Pawn structure's different. White hasn't castled yet. So you can see the better player winning. Rook a8. Finally, white castles. Black gets rid of the two bishops with knight takes c3. Queen f6, going for the queen trade. Hoping after queen takes, pawn takes, black has the threat of this b pawn. So Magnus played queen d2. Putting pressure on the d7 pawn. Rook d8, b5, attacking the knight. Knight goes in the center. They trade, and white plays c6. Obviously, you can't take on c6 because queen takes rook on d8. So Naiditsch plays bishop c8, the only move. Rook d1, pinning the pawn again. Keep pinning the pawn. d5. Now, a lot of you want to take en passant here, but it's illegal. That doesn't stop some of you, but you can't take en passant. If I try to take this way or this way, it doesn't work because that's not what en passant is. But nice try. Okay, Magnus played queen d4, trading queens. Naiditsch said, fine, I'll trade queens with you. And now you'll notice the big advantage white has because black's bishop on c8 is very bad. And he makes it permanently bad by playing the move f4, stopping black from ever playing e5. So this bishop basically can't move the rest of the game. So black is just trying to hold. Just chill, defend everything, and try to draw by white not being able to win. Okay, so he takes the a file. They move their king up. And now he gets his rook, where maybe his rook will go to the h file. Maybe he'll come down the a file. He wants to have a choice. Black can't do very much. That's what happens when you play Magnus. h4, h5, they trade. Now he takes the h file. You can't play rook g7 stopping rook h7 check because rook h8 wins your bishop. Pretty pathetic bishop. So he plays g5, getting counterplay, takes. He plays king to d6. If he plays rook takes, again, your bishop is trapped and you can't defend it. So Naiditsch plays king here. He wants to play e5 and get his bishop out. Rook h6, Magnus says, nope, you're not playing e5, and you still can't take on g5 because of rook to h8. King back to e7, bishop f3, stopping e5 again because the d pawn's hanging. Plays e5 anyway because he can't do anything, and eventually white's going to win by moving his king up. and he'll have an extra past g-pawn. So he gives some pawns away to get through and break through in the center. Rook h7 check, takes check. He attacks the b pawn. If you take the e pawn, white has two connected passed pawns on the queen side. b6 and b7 would win pretty quickly. So he plays king c5, so he can take the pawn on b5. Takes. Bishop takes d5. And in this position, the rook is attacked. The rook's defending the bishop. And if the rook moves somewhere where it's defending the bishop, white just moves his g-pawn up and the game is over. So after bishop takes, white being 3 pawns up and having all these passed pawns, Naiditsch resigned. So in that game, we saw Magnus get 2 bishops, a space advantage. He traded away the 2 bishops, but kept his space advantage. And eventually, his pawns on the queen side decided the game, as well as black's terrible bishop after Magnus played c6. So if you look at that game, you'll say, wow, that opening's great for white. Well, Magnus is better than Naiditsch, although Naiditsch has beaten Magnus, I think, twice, but not in that game. Okay, and I don't want to make it look like white always wins. So now we'll look at another game. This is Wesley So, white against Magnus. The only thing this lecture proves is that Magnus always wins. And this was played in the Pro Chess League. And I wanted to show you this game, not only because black won, but because I played in this match. This was the match that our team actually beat Magnus's team. Unfortunately, Magnus won all of his games, but his teammates didn't do so well. And we actually became the Pro Chess League champions, and this was the match. This was the final match. But we didn't do well against Magnus. Magnus played the Bogo-Indian, I'm sorry. After facing the Bogo-Indian, Magnus plays both sides. That shows you the opening is good. It's good for white, it's good for black. The better player is going to win. Wesley played bishop to d2, and black has several moves here. Black can play queen e7, c5, a5, bishop takes d2. They've all been played before. And he played a5. That's an older move. Wesley played a3, and Magnus traded. And white took with the queen, because white wants to play knight c3. The knight's better on c3 than d2. It's more active. Okay, b6, just like Naiditsch. Bishop b7. And he played g3. Now the difference is, from this game and the last game, is Magnus played knight d2. So in this position, Magnus had a bishop on c1, not a knight on c3. And he played b4 before a5 and bishop b2. So white doesn't have the 2 bishops here, so it's hard for white to claim an advantage. g3, castles, bishop g2, looks very solid for both sides. Knight e4, takes. And if you told me this was Wesley So and Magnus, and you didn't tell me who was who, because Wesley could be black here too, it happens he's white, I would assume the game would end in a draw because it's pretty equal. But as I said, often in the Bogo-Indian, the better player wins because the position is dynamically equal. Okay, castles, and black played a4. This is an important positional move, which freezes white's pawns. If white plays b3 or b4, he gets an isolated a pawn, and sometimes black can stick his knight on b3 and just sit in white's position. a4 is a good positional move. Queen e3 attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back. Queen d3 wants to play e4. f5, very similar to what Naiditsch did against Magnus. Knight e5, trading the bishops. Bishop takes, king takes. d6, the knight has to go back. Queen f6, and again, this looks pretty equal. It doesn't look like anybody has an advantage. Okay, e4, and in the end, this actually cost Wesley that he had a weakened king side and gave black the f-file. Black is sort of hoping that white plays e4 because after the pawns get traded on e4 or f5, black has the f-file. Magnus played knight c6, developing his knight. Rook e1, rook a5, that's an unusual way to develop your rook. d5, blocking the rook. And he takes on e4, queen takes on d5, pawn takes. And now he plays a move, Magnus does, that looks impossible. Magnus plays knight e7, And you're like, wait a minute, isn't that knight hanging? Well, then this knight is hanging, and now you're going to lose your d-pawn. And white's king is under tremendous attack also. So Wesley played rook d1, defending his d-pawn. Queen f5. He said, you take my knight, I'll take your knight. And unfortunately, the pawn structure favors black, unfortunately for Wesley, because the b-pawn is weak, the d-pawn is weak, and black's pawn structure is more compact. So he didn't trade queens, which would have been safer. He traded knights instead. Rook c5. Magnus wants to play rook c2, and Magnus defends his c7 pawn. And black is just clearly better here, because black's queen is so active on f3, and the f2 pawn is weak on this half-open line. The d5 pawn is also weak. Rook d2, stopping rook c2. h6, getting luft. Rook e1. Rook f5, attacking the d pawn again. Rook e3, attacking the queen. Rook c1 check. Rook goes back to e1. They traded. Now black can't play rook takes d5 because white plays queen e6 check. Then Wesley beats Magnus. But Magnus isn't going to hang his rook. Magnus played rook e5, queen c1, b5. Magnus hopes that Wesley will take on c7. Then he has mate in 1. That's not going to happen. So Wesley plays h3. And then Magnus runs his king over to defend his c-pawn, which is very funny. h4, king h2, king d8. And he's like, yay, I defended my c-pawn. Now I can finally play rook takes d5. But Wesley played queen h1, defending his d-pawn with an x-ray. That's pretty cool. The rook and pawn ending may be a draw, so Magnus played queen b3, keeping the queens on the board. Queen g2, fianchettoing his queen. Rook e1, queen h3, queen f3, threatening rook h1 mate and queen h1 mate. Wesley's in terrible time trouble now. Plays queen g2, queen f5. And here, white is much worse in this position. It's very hard to find a move for white. If I said make a move, you can't move this, you don't want to move that, can't move that. Moving this doesn't make any sense, just loses the pawn. g4 is insane because queen f4 check. Moving the f pawn looks crazy. There's no legal king move. And queen f3 and queen e4 and queen f1 and queen g1 and queen h1 hang the queen. It's very hard to find a move here for white. No, white just goes here. And so that's why Wesley blundered. There's almost no moves to make. So probably black is already winning, just because white is in sort of a zugzwang. But Wesley blundered. He played queen h3, which looks reasonable until you see black's response. Then it doesn't look reasonable anymore. Even super grandmasters make blunders, especially when their position is bad and they're in terrible time trouble. Magnus played rook h1 check, and Wesley resigned. So Magnus was the better player that game. He outplayed Wesley, and he ended up winning the game. The Bogo-Indian is a good opening for either side when you're playing for a win. It's not very drawish. You get really exciting kinds of games. They're strategically exciting, not necessarily tactically exciting. But they become tactically exciting later. Okay, we've had enough of Magnus. Magnus keeps beating everybody. This is a game, Alexander Khalifman versus Viswanathan in the 1997 FIDE World Championship knockout. Now the first two games I showed you from the white side, so let's flip it. Let's look at it from the black side, because that evens it out. That makes everything fair. Okay, so Anand has the black pieces, and they transpose. White plays c4, black plays bishop b4 check. Now this isn't a world championship knockout, and these players like Carlsen and Anand and Naiditsch and the person coming up next, these are all world-class players, so you know the opening is sound because everybody who's 27, 2800 is playing it for both sides. Very reasonable opening. Okay, now in this game, Khalifman played knight d2, which we saw in the first game where Carlsen beat Naiditsch. Anand castled. This is the game Khalifman versus Anand. a3, bishop takes knight. You can also play bishop e7 and let white play d4. That's a theoretical line also. but bishop takes knight is more in the spirit of the Bogo-Indian. He takes with the bishop. He could have taken with the queen like Magnus did and played b4, bishop b2, but he didn't. b6 from Anand, bishop g5, bishop b7, e3, and you would say that white has slightly better. White has a little bit more space, and white has the two bishops, but look how solid black's position is. This is a good position to outplay your opponent if you're the better player. Khalifman, Anand in 97, then Anand was the better player. Castles, h6, and you play c5. Typically, we don't want to play c5 if d5 is a good move, but here d5 just loses a pawn for white, so c5 is excellent. Bishop g3, attacking the weakened d pawn, d5, and now we're going to get a lot of trades, and the most likely result is a draw because everybody's trading everything in the center. cd, and Anand plays the move that's the most exciting. He takes with the pawn. If Anand was begging for a draw, he would take with the bishop, which stops the move e4, and try to trade on d4 and get a symmetrical pawn structure. But Anand plays for the win. He takes with the e-pawn. That makes the game more double-edged, and Khalifman gives Anand the hanging pawns. And black could play knight takes c5 and give up the d4 square, hoping the e4 square is good compensation. But Anand accepted the hanging pawns with bc5. That's what these pawns are called. Sometimes white moves around and wins those pawns, and sometimes those pawns march in and gain a lot of space and take away the center squares from white's pieces. So it's a double-edged thing, and again, the better player usually wins. b4, getting rid of the hanging pawns. He's hoping for a trade here, and then black has an isolated d pawn. Anand played knight e4, activating his knight. Rook c1, putting pressure on the pawn again. Knight takes g3. He gets rid of Khalifman's two bishops and plays c4. And as you all know, c4 is explosive. Bishop goes to f5, and black plays knight f6. So black has given away the d4 square to white. In compensation, black has a passed pawn. His knight has e4, and it's hard for white to have a good plan here. If you said, what's white's plan? I'm not sure. Maybe play a4, b5, knight d4, control the c6 square. Okay, queen d4, blocking it up, putting his queen in the center. Queen b6, rook fd1. The engine still says it's about equal. Bishop to c8, that's a really high-class move. He says, let's trade bishops because my bishop on b7 is blocked by my pawn. And that way, I'll get e4 for my knight because you don't have a bishop defending e4. And Khalifman says, no, I like my bishop. We're going to keep my bishop. Eventually, my queen will go to this diagonal, and I'll checkmate you. That seems unlikely. Bishop to g4, pinning the knight. And then he plays e4, which is fine. And after rook e8, now Khalifman plays a series of bad moves and loses the game. So according to the engine, he takes d5, bishop f3, queen takes, pawn takes, g takes. The engine says this is equal. It says all zeros. Because a lot of pawns are going to get traded, and it'll be a drawn endgame. Okay, but Khalifman, after rook e8 made a bad move, he played queen takes queen immediately, and now he's much worse. And the reason is, after the take back, and we take on d5, black has a move perhaps was overlooked by Khalifman, perhaps, or he underestimated it. Okay, and black played the move b5, which is a pawn sacrifice, because white took this pawn on d5, and black said, my pawn on c4 is pretty important. I'm going to defend that. Your a3 pawn's attacked, your knight's pinned, and your d pawn is weak. Now black has a big advantage, and Khalifman wasn't able to defend properly. Rook c3, defending his a pawn. Rook d8, which wins the d pawn. The d pawn can't be saved. So he starts to trade pieces. Rook a8, he wants to win the a pawn, and he does. Now the b4 pawn is very weak, And even though white has a passed d pawn, it's easily stopped and blocked. The d pawn doesn't go anywhere, but if I take your b pawn, I'm going to have two connected passed pawns on the queen side. So he played e5, knight d7, e6, tries to get some attack going, bishop takes, knight d4, threatening the bishop and threatening the b pawn. Bishop attacks the rook. Knight takes, attacks this rook. Everybody has a rook hanging. Rook b3. Now this rook is attacked. The rook can't move vertically because your bishop is attacked. And once he moves the rook horizontally, rook takes b4, and black's a pawn up. It's a passed pawn, and white has these double isolated pawns. So white's worse anyway, but now white's just losing. Bishop c2, playing for tricks. If rook takes knight, bishop takes c4 check, and now white's probably winning. Anand didn't fall for that. He played knight b6, defending his pawn. Knight c3, bishop e6, and Anand wrapped it up with his extra pawn in the endgame. He traded knights, and now black's king is going to walk up the board and win, and if white's king moves over to stop that, then you lose your g2 pawn, and you're down 2 pawns, which is exactly what happened. And Anand took the second pawn, always play bishop f1, and Anand gets passed pawns on both sides of the board. And after h5, white resigned. Black's going to play h4, trade on h4, and then push his g-pawn. And eventually the king and the g-pawn will win the bishop, and black has a winning position. With his extra 2 pawns here, he'll win the bishop for one of the pawns, and he'll still have pawns remaining. So that was a good example of outplaying your opponent from an equal position, which is exactly how you win in a Bogo-Indian. The position's computer equal, but it's not human equal. The computer says both sides play perfect, it's a draw, but it's not boring like some Petrovs are, and some, although not the Petrov we're trying to learn, obviously, or the Berlin Wall. Sometimes those games get to move 20, 25, and it's pretty symmetrical. That doesn't happen in the Bogo-Indian. We don't see any symmetry. We see dynamic equality, which leads to people winning because people make mistakes. Okay, last but not least is a game Kasparov played against Urday. Urday is an IM or a GM from South America. And this was played in Lima in Peru in 1993. And Kasparov used to do this like once a year. I've never seen Carlsen do it. Carlsen could do it. Kasparov used to give simuls against 4 grandmasters. And typically there was a clock, and both sides would get 40 moves in 2 hours on all 4 clocks. And he would play like an Olympic team like Germany, or he would just play 4 random GMs, and sometimes 5, and he would just play a simul. Because he was so much better than everybody, he won all of those simuls. He gave a simul against the German Olympic team. So the 4 best players in Germany, and he beat them. He never won 4-0, but he'd win like 3-1 or something like that. Okay, this was in a simul he gave in Peru in 1993. Kasparov was white, and they played Bogo-Indian. Kasparov played bishop to d2. So we've seen 2 games with bishop d2 and 2 games with knight bd2. And we're going to see 2 games that white wins and 2 games that black wins. Black played a5, which we've seen. We saw Magnus do that against Wesley. So knight c3. Now it looks more like a Nimzo-Indian with these moves put in. Neither of those moves looks too great, but they're okay. b6, e3, and Kasparov develops his pieces, gets all his minor pieces out. He's going to castle, and he hopes that black is going to take on c3 and give him the 2 bishops. Castles, queen c2, d6. Now he has to give up his bishop because he can't go back anywhere. Knight d7, e4, e5. And here Kasparov made a really interesting move. Like if I was playing a blitz game, I would play d5 without thinking. Then white has more space, and he blocks the bishop on b7. Although it does give away the c5 square to the black knight. So d5 is a double-edged kind of move. It sort of hurts black, but it helps black a little also. But Kasparov played knight to d5, confusing the audience. And that's just what Kasparov wanted to do, was confuse his opponent. The knight on d5 is really good also. So now everything is attacked. There's all kinds of captures in the position, making it difficult for somebody to find the right line of play. But probably there's more than one right way of playing where black can be almost equal. He traded on d2, queen takes. Then he played c5, which I think is a big mistake. I think he played c5 thinking he would block everything up and it would be easier to draw. Back in the 1990s, weaker grandmasters wanted to draw Kasparov because Kasparov was considered like the greatest player of all time and he was always beating everybody, so drawing him with black would be good. And c5, white's forced to capture because white can't lose his d-pawn. And we have this pawn structure which is very symmetrical, with the difference being white's knight is on d5, but black's knight has a heck of a time getting to d4, so white's actually better. And eventually, black couldn't take the white knight on d5 and just traded. And he took bishop takes d5, and then Kasparov can take either way. He took with the e-pawn, so his rook is open and his bishop is open, and he has a passed d-pawn. And typically, black would want to play knight to d6 here, but it's hard to play because we have to defend our e-pawn. So it's hard to play knight to d6. If somehow I could defend my d-pawn and play knight to d6, that would be a great knight blockading the passed pawn. The queen is not a good blockader. The queen wants to do other stuff. So he defended his e-pawn, and Kasparov attacked his e-pawn. h3 getting luft. Rook e1, rook e8. And now it's just a big fight of defending and attacking the e-pawn. And Kasparov didn't do very much, but eventually he opened up the queen side since he couldn't win the e-pawn on its own. And he played a3 and b4 eventually, after moving around a lot, doing nothing. And then finally, he played the move b4. Okay, now white has a threat. White's threatening the pawn on a5, and then white would be a pawn up, and the c5 pawn would be weak. So he traded on b4, and then black played rook a7 and said, haha, I have the a file. I was waiting for you to play b4 so I could take the a file. Kasparov played queen b2, and now black has to watch out. Sometimes bc is winning. It's not now because the queen's defending the rook. So he's safe at the moment. Queen d6, rook b1. Now bc might be annoying. Rook f8, bc, pawn takes. Rook a3, Kasparov takes over the a file and the b file. Rook e7, queen e2. He doesn't want black to get counterplay with e3. Knight d7, the knight wants to go to e5. They trade. He has to take with the queen. If he takes with the rook, he loses his e-pawn. Then white's just clearly better here because white has the passed d-pawn and black has no passed pawns. And this c-pawn is very weak. It can easily be attacked by white's rooks and queen. Queen e3 attacking the pawn. Rook b3, the rooks are going to come down and attack. Rook c8, rook b7. He trades off the black piece that was defending e4. Now white has the 7th rank. f5, defending the e4 pawn. Black wants to play queen e5 and f4 and get counterplay. g3, stopping f4. Queen a6 with a double attack, attacking the pawn and the rook. Queen b3, defending both. Check. Queen d4, black has an excellent queen. Rook b8, trading rooks. Black didn't want to trade rooks, so played rook f8, but Kasparov's like, no, let's trade rooks. Okay, because the only thing black can do in this position to get counterplay is play like f4, rook f8, and start an attack on white's king. If black doesn't have an attack on white's king, then my d-pawn's going to win. The d-pawn is too strong. Kasparov played queen b8 check, gave him a few checks. Queen f4, wants to take the f5 pawn with check. So g6, queen c7 check, queen d6 check. and in this position black resigned. I put this position on my engine and it said white is +7. I was like, that's a good time to resign. If you play king g5 and I check you, you could get checkmated. That would be pretty cool. If you play queen f6, it's worse than checkmate, because now you lose your queen and then you get checkmated. So that's even worse. And if you play king back somewhere, doesn't matter where, g7 or f7, I check you and I push my d pawn and my queen, and white's going to play d7, d8 queen. If black plays for counterplay, white just ignores it. And white's going to play d8 queen check next move. So after queen d6 check, black resigned, and obviously Kasparov won the Simul because he always did. And that would actually be interesting today if Carlsen would give a Simul against some Olympic team, you know, like Germany or, you know, probably not the US. The US Olympic team would probably beat Carlsen in a Simul because those are pretty good players. But just, you know, 4 typical grandmasters against Carlsen, and Carlsen's playing 4 at the same time, I would still bet on Carlsen. Just like you bet on Kasparov, and he won all those matches. Kasparov was so much better than the average grandmaster, he could play 4 or 6 at a time in a Simul and still get a plus score, which he did several times. And in that game, there was very little tactics. It was very positional and strategical, and even though white never won any material, eventually his passed pawn was a winning passed pawn. There's nothing that black could do about it. So to go back a little bit about the Bogo-Indian, let me go to an empty board. Okay, in the Bogo-Indian, this is white avoiding the Nimzo-Indian with knight c3, bishop b4. So that means when white plays the Bogo-Indian, it's very rare he's going to play knight c3 here, because then he's playing a Nimzo-Indian where he's forced to play knight f3 right away, and he already didn't want to play a Nimzo-Indian, so it's unlikely he'll play knight c3. If you play the Bogo-Indian, you have to know knight c3 though, and it's very likely if you have black and you play the Bogo-Indian, it's likely you play the Nimzo-Indian also. It's the same move, except it pins the knight. Some people don't like to have their knight pinned, so they play knight f3. And if you have black, you have to know what to do against bishop d2 and knight d2. And it's not just the games that I showed you. I could show you 50 games, and both sides would have different setups. In the games I showed you, black was always playing b6 and bishop b7, but that's not always the case. Sometimes black doesn't do that. Sometimes black moves his bishop back and plays d5, knight bd7, c5. There's different ways to play with both sides. And that's one good thing about the Bogo-Indian is if your opponent can't just say, oh, they play the Bogo-Indian, I just do this. Like if your opponent plays bishop d2, I've played c5. And what white does against c5 is a lot different than what white does against a5 or bishop takes d2. And some people take here, then there's an argument whether white should play e3 or g3, and black usually plays a5, b6, bishop b7, and this pawn's annoying. White can't play knight c3, so a lot of guys play a3 pretty quickly to get rid of that pawn. That's an annoying pawn. So c5 is an interesting move, a5 is an interesting move, and we didn't even look at queen e7, which is also played quite often. And after queen e7, g3, bishop takes, this is a known line also. So there's a lot that can happen in the Bogo-Indian, and there's a lot of ways to avoid it with both sides. If you're black and you don't want to play a Bogo-Indian, you can play the Queen's Indian with b6. You can play d5 and get into some kind of Queen's Gambit. You can play the Benoni with c5. And so if you play the Bogo-Indian with black, that gives you a little preparation advantage, because if you have white, you have to be prepared for Queen's Indian, Bogo-Indian, Benoni, Queen's Gambit declined. And if you're like, well, I just play the Bogo-Indian, and my opponent has to know all these other lines. And so typically, what lower ranked players do is they just have one line ready. So they play bishop d2, and maybe they know one move for black that they've seen, and you could play another move and they don't know it, then they're on their own. And the positions are strategically very interesting, so there's a lot of winning and losing. There's not a lot of draws in this opening because the position is never gets to be some kind of symmetrical position, which you see with a lot of other openings, where the pawn structure is stable. It's not clear if black's going to play d6 at knight d7, or play d5, or play c5, or fianchetto his bishop. Sometimes they play bishop a6 and attack this pawn. Sometimes white fianchettos, and sometimes white plays e3, bishop d3, which we saw Kasparov do. So the Bogo-Indian has a lot of richness, and you can play either side and play for a win. I hope you enjoyed that lecture. I know I did. Go the Bogo-Indian. But remember, nobody wins by force. Typically, the better player wins. I want to thank Patrick Wheeler again. Patrick has sponsored a lot of our lectures, and this is one of them. I think he sponsored something like 10 or 11 lectures. So if you want to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife Karen at aclchessclub.com, and you too can sponsor a lecture. Until next week, thanks for watching, everybody. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Bye.